Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by onlinegreatbooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. Welcome to another Online Great Books podcast. I am Scott Hambrick, and today I have one of my favorite human beings with me, one of my mentors, actually. I want to blow smoke up your ass. Brett Veinoitte of the School Sucks Project podcast and website, and he was a big inspiration to me in pulling my kids out of school and home educating my kids, and then ultimately myself, and then later on the folks helping people at Online Great Books further their own educations. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about the history of schooling and some current events, I think, that have bearing for all of us. But welcome, and thanks for doing this, man.
My pleasure. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm looking forward to this, as always.
You introduced me to the works of John Taylor Gatto, and we lost him last year. I'm still sad about it. Probably always will be. He wrote The Underground History of American Education, and most of what I know about the history of American education I learned from you and Gatto and Richard Groves of the Tragedy and Hope podcast. So I wanted to bring you on to have a little conversation and maybe bring some of these ideas and some of these, some of this history to our listeners.
Absolutely, yeah, and we got to stand on the shoulders of those folks in learning this stuff. They made it so much easier. I always mention Gatto, 30 years ago, writing letters to Harvard University and trying to find out about some obscure education program they had in the 30s, and taking that information and putting it into his book. It made just this. It gave us a map of a labyrinth, right? That was still, there were unknown and unseen places to navigate. But it made it so much easier to at least get in there and start, trying to find our way around and understand this vastly complex history of schooling in the United States, and that also includes higher education.
Yes, I think the main, if I can say one thing that I learned about American education from Gatto, and there are a lot of things, but if I can think of one big overarching thing that I learned from him, is that the way we educate people, or I'm making scare quotes, educate, whether we school people in the United States, being a 44-year-old guy, that seems to be the way that people do this, right? It's normal for me, but I have learned from Gatto that it's actually an experiment, and people haven't been doing it this way for very long.
Right, and it's an ongoing experiment that is being refined behind the scenes. Are you familiar with Charlotte Iserby?
Mm-hmm. I know the name.
So Charlotte Iserby wrote a book 20 years ago called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. At least I think that was the first edition of this book. Charlotte Iserby was somebody who had worked as kind of like a liaison, I believe, in the Reagan administration in the Department of Ed, and she started. She's very passionate about these issues, very much a traditionalist, very much in favor of a traditional liberal education, was more conservative, so didn't like, progressives making inroads and trying to change it with some kind of political agenda. So she was always very sensitive to that. And she's definitely an older woman. I think today she's probably in her 80s, and she's still out there speaking about this. But she was somebody who, through that book and through her experience that she recounts in the book, really turned up the volume on this idea that throughout the 20th century, how children are, again, finger quotes, educated, has been an ongoing experiment. And a lot of it is about producing desirable behavioral outcomes for those in power. And attitude outcomes, this is actually called outcome-based education, another thing that she spoke about in her book and beyond. So, the experiment goes on right up until something I'm sure most listeners are familiar with called Common Core, which in many ways was, a project that moved throughout the 20th century, but this was, not the intention the entire time, but certainly a realization of the sort of public private partnerships in public education. And by that, I mean the public, foots the bill, and private unaccountable people get to decide how the system works for a variety of their own interests and motivations.
So before we get on put our tinfoil hats on.
Oh, we'll have them on soon. Yeah, I hope.
Yeah. I do too. That's where it gets fun. That's where the good pod comes in.
Right.
Well, let's go back to the beginnings of what we call modern schooling in North America. So in the beginning there was a man.
Yes.
Horace Mann. Is that where we start, Brett?
I think it's a pretty good place to start as far as the United States is concerned. And the only prehistory that's really necessary is that in the early half of the 1800s, a Central European kingdom called Prussia, most of Prussia became modern-day Germany, was involved in a number of military skirmishes with France, at that time controlled by Napoleon. And they had suffered some embarrassing defeats. One was in a place called Jena, and at that point they said, we're not going to be able to expand this kingdom. We're not going to be able to realize our imperial ambitions if we don't have good fire discipline. If we can't produce soldiers who will stay in line and absorb gunfire for the good of the state. And this was actually where the state school project was born in the first and second decade of the 1800s in Prussia. So they basically produced a system where the idea of nationalism, the idea of prioritizing the state over the individual, over individual interests, would be put into the heads of one class, a very large class of children. It was probably over 90% of the Prussian population. And they would go to school and they would learn to be obedient. And then there was a second tier of this education system. The bottom tier that almost everybody attended was called the Volksschule, and the middle tier was called the Realschule, which basically meant real school. So you have the people's school where you learn obedience, and the Volksschule, or the Realschule, where you learn to manage the obedient. And then there was an elite level, Akademienschulen, which would be basically like the top tier of education, like the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbias in the United States. So they had this three-tiered system that many people, not just Horace Mann, and not just even from the United States, people from France, people from England, and again, people like Mann from the United States, went on these tours in the middle of the 1800s and issued these travelers' reports back to the people who were interested in creating a national education system or even state education systems in the United States, or obviously they were looking to borrow from Prussia and England and borrow from Prussia and France. Mann issued his report and said, I think we can do this in the United States. And yes, the system is very authoritarian. It demands obedience. It demands conformity. But we could certainly, after all, we're America. We could find a way to use it in furtherance of our Republican institutions. That's almost a direct quote. But he got the Prussian style of education adopted in Massachusetts, and it spread like wildfire across the country in the latter half of the 1900s. So you had this system that, we know how it wound up in Germany 100 years later, now implemented in the United States, where most people were learning obedience, conformity. As a result of that, they were predictable. And as a result of that, in many important ways, like the things we'd like to think about education, not putting into people, but definitely accentuating, like already existing qualities that we'd like education to accentuate, like, curiosity, individuality, creativity, ambition. All of those things just kind of replaced with apathy, right? As a result of obedience and conformity, you're outsourcing personal responsibility. You are schooled to do that. So what's left and I think this is, very relevant to a lot of the people who are part of Online Great Books, you're left very much with a political, historical, and philosophical apathy. Most people just they leave school with absolutely no interest in those pursuits, and that is very much by design.
Yeah, so there are a couple of elements that you've described here in this design. So it is a militaristic system, right? We still see that. Elementary school class sizes are platoon-sized.
Sure.
You stand in line, you move by the bells.
Yeah.
Right? You ring the bell, they stand up, you ring the bell, you sit down. So early on, you get kids used to that size of a group, moving by orders, standing in line, just all that really basic stuff. And the apathy thing is one of the most insidious things about schooling in the United States. I think, and I think Gatto agreed with this, that it's specifically designed to frustrate the student. And if we can frustrate the student's curiosity early on, and if you can do that persistently enough, both by choking down the curriculum and subjecting them to their peers, you end up with a person who doesn't feel like they have agency and they're apathetic.
And it's also very desirous of input from authority, right? More than input. Input is a euphemism, right? They want leadership. They want control that can be presented as leadership. They crave it, right? Somebody will tell us what to do, because I think a part of that is, yes, like you said, a lack of trust in self, but also a lack of trust in others. It's not, and it has, school became increasingly worse for the coherence and togetherness of communities over the course of 20th century. It pits people against each other. It teaches distrust. Schools claim that they prepare people for citizenship. I would say they make good on that, right?
Right.
They definitely,
If riding a school bus doesn't shatter your faith in mankind, I don't know what would.
Well, yeah, I mean, but they definitely break people into wanting to be governed. And of course, once the schools are an institution, they can be modified to get people over time to accept more and more governance as a result. And we've certainly seen that in the 20th century.
But, Brett, don't you think that's a good idea in a republic?
That people want to be, well, I mean, no, I don't. I don't. Because if you think about the unaccountable nature of the schools to the public in many ways, and there are like little performances like PTA meetings and school boards, but even if you look at the history of those things, like if people want to make that kind of argument or expand the kind of argument that you just introduced, like isn't this good, and isn't this what you want in a republic, and can't people participate in this, however they want to expand that argument. If you actually looked into like the history of school boards, you would see in the latter half of the 20th century, and certainly I think since, maybe the last 30 years, I mean, the Federal Department of Education and this ramp up to federalize and centralize education in the United States, that's only really been in my lifetime. I mean, there were definitely precursors to a Department of Education, a Federal Department of Education, all the way back to probably the beginning of the 20th century, maybe even before the 20th century. The idea to centralize public schooling and have like a central national control for it. You can see the number of school boards just drop off starting in 1950 right up to the present day. There is a fraction, I wish I had the numbers, I don't, a fraction of what there used to be as far as the number of school boards, the number of entryways to participation in this system. And, just quickly back to Charlotte Iserby, she was talking about when she started to turn up the volume on all of these concerns that she had, a friend of hers who I think was sympathetic said, "Oh, you have to go. You have to go to Maine to this training, and you can see how bad it really is." So she got Charlotte Iserby into this training in Maine, and it was like change agent training, which was basically how the techniques you need to use to covertly adjust the schools behind the back of the parents and the students, but then also who you need to manipulate to make sure that nobody interferes with those changes, right? How do you identify the troublemakers in your community and silence them? But also, how do you identify the influencers, like the people at the Chamber of Commerce, and get to them first and get them to agree to the changes that you want to make in a system? And this was a project that people were being sent away to camp, basically, in Maine to learn how to do this. And that's only one example.
Is this the Delphi method?
The Delphi
that they were teaching
method.
there?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Go. Hey, let's do a show about that later.
Sure.
Go read about that on Wikipedia, y'all. Delphi method is super spooky, and once you read about that method and start to see how that works, you'll find that everywhere you turn, you will see that in these supposed town hall meetings, the op-ed columns in your local paper, if you still read that rag, the school board meetings, and so on. It's used to influence public discourse all the time.
Sure.
It's pretty remarkable. So you said performances, PTA is performance,
Yeah, it is something that people can latch onto to feel good, to maybe feel efficacious. Like the PTA exists, the school board exists. There is still such a thing as parent-teacher conferences. But, from my perspective, in addition to being the creator of the School Sucks Project, I also worked in this system and I saw it from a variety of different angles. And one of the last angles from which I viewed public schooling was as a private service provider. And I would sit through these meetings where they would talk about accommodations and modifications. And I remember walking out of there and thinking, gosh, if I said anything that I thought in that meeting, I would lose my job, right? I worked for a company, but I would lose these clients. And the whole thing really just felt like a play, right? Like everybody was just role-playing a part of let's help Steve while making Steve feel bad about himself, and hopefully Steve just conforms. So hopefully we just break Steve through making him sit here and listen to us drone on about accommodations and modifications. That's how it felt to me. But I already had people like Gatto in my ear at this point, so that wasn't helping my positive attitude.
Maybe I can say something that sounds less cynical, although I'm as cynical as you are. You've got Common Core. That has been a big stink about that. And there have been many, many movements over the last 100 years like Common Core. It's nothing new.
Right.
But we know that there is more and more top-down control of schooling, from the federal level every day. So even if you're hopeful and feel good about your efforts in participating with the parent-teacher association or whatever, or the school board, you have to realize that the things that even if that was a good organization, and even if that was a good structure, the things that are left up to those organizations are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then if you're like me and you just think it was all kabuki theater anyway.
Sure. When really throughout the 20th century, it's kind of this like I said, it's not a uniform plan run by the same group of people, but it is this behind the scenes competition of who gets to be the Archimedes, basically, of society, using education as looking to get the right place to stand and their hands on the lever to be able to make dramatic changes. And there's ideological interests that compete for this. Most of the control has been corporate interests, at least in the latter half of the 20th century. How corporations can order from the public schools the type of labor that they need. But even though, the school's original intention in Prussia was military, in the United States, at first adoption in Massachusetts and beyond, it was about homogenation and standardization of an expanding immigrant population. So, you have these this convergence in the latter half of the 1800s of three big things. You have the end of slavery, which was certainly a reliable labor force in a significant region of the country. And a lot of these people moved down south to set up schools there. You have this influx of immigrants, the first big wave of immigration to the United States, and you have the Industrial Revolution. So all three of these necessitate the existence of school, but with the Industrial Revolution, building good industrial workers is really the first input from business. But once corporate interests start giving input, they never stop. So all of these like national education initiatives that we've seen, at least in the 21st century now, starting with No Child Left Behind and moving on to Common Core, basically work towards that same purpose. That there are corporate private interests who want to use publicly funded resources to create the labor force that they want.
Yeah, so we started with, there was this big military interest in training the citizenry, essentially.
Right.
My mother's side of the family is from rural Oklahoma, Chelsea, Oklahoma area. Mm-hmm. And I would talk to my grandmother and my mom, and I had a bunch of great uncles who would have been World War II age, and none of them were in World War II. Mm. And I always thought, what the hell was going on there, you know? And I now know they were farm people, and they weren't nationalists. They didn't care, and they hid. Like, they weren't acculturated by school. You know, if they get a draft notice, they didn't care.
Right.
In Chelsea, Oklahoma, they're like, we got cows to milk and crops to get in. France can go France. you know, they didn't care. And so the schooling didn't extend to them, and it didn't work. So a lot of people would say, oh, they were a bunch of bumpkins. They only went to school through 4th grade or 6th grade or whatever. Well, yeah, that's right. But they also didn't get their ass shot off. And then, and one of the reasons they didn't is because they weren't acculturated in that way. So, you know, it works in that way, right? Like, how do you get people to show up when they get a draft notice? Well, you start when they're in kindergarten, I think is how you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, they didn't have that experience. It kind of reminds me of John Dewey's attitude about war itself. Like, John Dewey was obviously a huge proponent of public education, but I learned from Thaddeus Russell that despite him being a progressive, because progressives loved war. And John Dewey loved war because he saw it as a way to standardize society. It was another tool for the standardization of society. So somebody is schooled.
Never waste a crisis.
Exactly. Somebody is schooled. It basically leaves them with a hook, right in their back, so that somebody can just come and pick them up and put them obediently where they need to go, right? No questions asked. As was the case in World War I, even World War I and World War II. And you know, that didn't even start to change until Vietnam. But yeah, if you hadn't been schooled, your attitude about exactly what Prussia was trying to prevent, right? Mm-hmm. 120 years before this, 130 years before this. If you're not trained in this, yeah, that's an insane proposition that I would go and take gunfire from people I've never had any problem with, I've never even met.
Yeah, I went to an insanely crappy school in Rogers County, Oklahoma, and we took the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test, or whatever. Like the military would come to school, they would put everybody in the lunchroom, and we all took the military aptitude test. And then they knew who we were. They knew, you know, what our aptitudes were. And then the recruiters came after us.
Yeah, and they could tell you a story about like, you want to be in the Army, you could do this in the Army. You're good at that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was they talk about school to prison pipeline, in rural Oklahoma, there is certainly like a school to military pipeline, and so they would use it for that purpose. And then you say, so there's this military purpose for the school. And then there's also this acculturation thing. How do we make people Americans? And I think that's actually a very interesting problem. So you said, we've got this slavery we get this Reconstruction issue, right? How do you make these people, the former members of the Confederate States of America, American again? How do you deal with these slaves that have had no prior, Western-style education? How do you deal with those people? How do you deal with the influx of Italian and Eastern European and Irish immigrants in the late 19th century? How do you deal with that? And my answer might be that you don't deal with it. But the powers that be, people, the architects of schooling thought that needed to be dealt with in some way. And so they would do that in schools.
Right. So
now we have this giant country that, where we all know a lot of the same things, 1776 and the George Washington chopped down the cherry tree story and we can all play the same Trivial Pursuit game and get the same score on it.
To a certain level, we can all play that game. Right. Yeah. Because just a side note is that only last statistics I knew, this could be more or less today, but it was about 1 in 6 Americans get some kind of education in history or social science beyond high school. The pattern that I identified when I was in school and when I taught school is that elementary school is very much about inculcating a mythology in America, right? So that's where you get the 1776 cherry tree stories, etc. And then the next 6 years, history is made so boring that most people never want to open another history book or anything that even relates to that pursuit. They never want to touch anything like that again in their lives.
And I think that serves to preserve the mythology.
It absolutely does. And I used to think, well, isn't it a shame that only 1 in 6 Americans get some history education after high school? And then I started thinking, like, all right, well, what do the humanities look like in college these days? Maybe that isn't even a bad thing anymore. I mean, I used to think it was a bad thing. Now, I will say, even though I had no intellectual self-defense, I had no critical thinking skills when I went to college, where would I have learned them? I, took on a very ideological left-wing worldview that was limiting, right? And it also came with a kind of air of superiority because I went to college, that kind of a thing. But it was, even though it kind of set me off down the wrong path for a while, it was a life-changing experience. And there's plenty of things about college that I regret, but that is actually something that I'm grateful for, that professor that I had. So my point is, I'm really conflicted on that 1 in 6 problem today. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, because a lot of people, I don't think, get to have the experiences and the revelations that I was fortunate enough to have beyond college that changed my thinking away from that mindset and kind of opened up the world to me in a lot of exciting and ultimately rewarding ways. But just back to your point, yeah, I think that is an indoctrination that gives people just sort of a vague idea of like, oh, there's nothing really to worry about. This is the greatest place I could live. And, maybe it is, but that doesn't mean it isn't fraught with all kinds of different problems. And I really don't need to think about it because of this American mythology. And then the next 6 years of school taught me that I never want to think about it again because it's so boring. So I just outsource any of that responsibility or agency to the people who know, right, at CNN or Fox News or wherever. And that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think some amount of this sort of acculturation, whatever, this mythologization, is probably useful. It makes it easier to relate to people.
Culture, sure,
yeah, it's culture. But the problem becomes, where do you get it from, and what, or who gives it to us, and then what is it? Is it something that you can get organically, or is it something that has to be set down in a curriculum? I certainly don't think it needs to be set down in a fixed curriculum, especially. And so here's one of my issues with schooling. So we're talking about this sort of, we already talked about, we have a problem when we have a conflict of interest when the government is that which educates or informs the governed. And I think that like Dewey in particular was keenly aware of that, and actually sought to take advantage of that and use that to the government's advantage. And so that's something that I have a big problem with. So we'll put a bookmark there. So we talked about the acculturation deal, the military problem, the acculturation deal, and then we have the Industrial Revolution, and then those corporate interests started expressing interest in developing an industrial workforce. It's hard to get agricultural people to stand in that one place for 8 hours and push the button and yank the lever, in that assembly line, and show up by the clock. And they were very, very interested in having that industrial workforce created for them, ready to go, ready to plug in to the assembly line, just like all the other interchangeable parts on the Model T or whatever else was being built.
And I think that who was the efficiency expert? Frederick Taylor, who was working around the turn of the century, had this long quote. I in the past have attributed this quote to the Rockefeller Education Board, but I think it might actually have originated with Frederick Taylor. This idea that we're not looking to produce, poets and lawyers and men of letters and scientists. We've got enough of that, right? What we want is people who will do in a perfect way the things that their parents are currently doing in an imperfect way. And that was what schooling became about at the turn of the century. And if you just line up our last two topics of conversation right there, people given a mythology as just sort of a foundation of understanding, like here's the only understanding you need of culture, of political science, of philosophy. All of that is just traded out for mythology. I mean, what was Thomas Jefferson's relationship like with John Adams? Wouldn't that be like so much more interesting and inspiring to most people than these bland mythological stories about cherry trees and lying and Plymouth Rock? I would think so. I always think about the story of the Pilgrims, and they're encountered by Squanto, who's there to. Do you know this story?
Yeah, it magically speaks English. Nobody says a word about it.
Right. It obscures one of the most fascinating stories about American history, that Squanto had been kidnapped by British fishermen and taken to Europe. He's just this kind of magical figure he's like a MacGuffin of the Pilgrim story. He's just kind of there. You just have to accept that he's there to help. He knows the language. He's by himself. It's very weird. But his story, 20 years leading up to his encounter with the settlers in 1620, is one of I would think, the most interest-inspiring stories that a young person can come across. With that obscured from education, it generally, you multiply that times 1,000, right? The missed opportunities of, and it relates so much to what you guys do at Online Great Books, right? Like, think about all of the conversations and the conflicts that are just omitted from history, right? Now, some do exist as long as they sort of move the narrative that the textbooks want to portray in the right direction. Like, obviously, you can't obscure every conflict that happened in history. But what about the founders? Were not a uniform group of people who agreed and who all wanted the same thing. People would get very, very little of that from the mythology, especially in their elementary school understanding of it. So what you're left with is basically school as something that isn't about education. It is about industrial training, right? Because all of that information, the wonders of learning, it is lost. And what people accept is this kind of training that we've moved on to in this other topic. That's what school is for. That's what you're there to do. You're not supposed to. You need to become accustomed to not enjoying how your time is spent 8-10 hours a day. You will change stations periodically. A bell will tell you when to do so. Very, very useful, the schools were, in replacing learning with industrial conditioning. that could have a military function, that could have, like an obedience to authority function, but also could have this just conditioning to, boredom, accepting boredom as a huge part of your waking life.
And so the progressives, like Dewey, said, yeah, that's kind of what it's about, and maybe that's what it should be about, right? Maybe not the liberal education, maybe not giving them the intellectual, self-defenses, but giving them the tools they need to succeed in this new world, right?
Right.
They need to be, we would be doing the student a disservice if we weren't putting them in a position to benefit from the Industrial Revolution, from being able to get that good factory job as opposed to the coal mine job, right? I think he meant well, actually.
That the new individualism, as he called it, that was his phrase, was the recognition of the psychosocial benefits of conforming to the collective, of merging your identity basically with the social superstructure of society. Right? That you are part of a group. That's the new individualism. The old individualism was, the rugged individual who, pursued his own goals and was enterprising. And that's not what we needed at the beginning of the 20th century in America. I think he understood that. And I think, from what I've read of Dewey and from what I know of Dewey, he's cast as such an evil figure by so many, like especially people more on the conservative side of education. He's basically like the devil. But I think one of his concerns, and when you really he was trying to make people illiterate, like when you really dig into what he's saying, he's not saying that at all. But no. He was very much a utopian socialist. And he saw and was certainly influenced by that industrialization of America. And I think the best spin you could put on it is, and I don't even think it's insincere, is to say he didn't want people left out in the cold, right? It's like, this is where we're going, and this is how you get involved, and this is how we onboard people into a new society. So. Yeah,
and you know what? I don't know that he's wrong. If it's 1912, and, it's, Ford Motor Company's starting to come online, and all of these industrial powerhouses that changed the West are starting to come online. Tractors are becoming less expensive. Nitrogen fertilizer showing up. Like crop yields are going way, way up. Like you just don't need the economic necessities of the time are telling us that agricultural payrolls are going to go down, and the economic pressure is going to be to go to the factory. So what do you do with that? What do you do? And I think as, free market folks would say, well, it'll be okay. It'll be taken care of. But now we still have this school that is fitted for creating these industrial sort of citizens. But it's changing again. And I think we've gone through the Industrial Revolution. We're going through this sort of knowledge economy revolution, and maybe even that's halfway over. And the job market is changing it again, and people are emerging from high school and college as a person who's employed a lot of people. I'll tell you, they're coming out of there unemployable as they are. They've spent a lot of money and a lot of time, and they're 22, 24 years old. And in Catoosa, we'd say they don't know shit from fat meat. Like we can't.
In what ways? Like what sticks out to you the most about that?
I have talked to people who had accounting degrees that did not know the difference between an invoice, a purchase order, and a statement, an account statement. I think just basic skills in these various disciplines are lacking. I mean, there you go. I mean, there's a concrete example, and I've run into that more than once where I would talk to someone in an accounting department who didn't know what those various accounting records were.
Right.
They didn't know. And then also there's an acculturation piece as well, right? You go through high school, you go through K through 12, and you go through college, and they have all sorts of expectations that aren't in line with reality. And they get out and they're shocked to find out, what reality's like. I mean, I don't want to sound all boomerish, but they have all sorts of expectations that maybe are fair to have. They've been told that they can go to school for these many years, and that they will be able to, have a certain sort of income. And by golly, I'm a college graduate. I shouldn't have to get dirty or whatever for a living. And that's the story they were told, and fairly or unfairly, that may not be the reality. And so they have expectations that, frankly, they don't jive with reality sometimes, and that ain't fair to them. But it's a problem we all have to deal with.
They have the in the profit model where one of the steps is missing the specific instructions. That trope. That's kind of their story, right? I think that it's fine that people alive today would have high expectations for the quality of life. How could you not? Looking at the opportunity.
They've been told from the beginning: go to college, accrue debt, profit.
That's the problem,
Yeah.
right? That if you look out at the world and you see the opportunity and you have some appreciation, like if you're 30 years old, or even if you're in your late 20s, you can see the amazing changes that have taken place in the world in your lifetime. Like you want to have a great life. It's just you have no idea of what the path is you have to walk to do it. And I think that the children of the baby boomer generation are in a particularly bad spot with a lot of this, especially those who are too young to appreciate the changes that we've witnessed in the last 20 years. Where it's exciting that they have I wouldn't call it ambition, but they have some vision of what they want. They just have no idea how to reverse engineer it to where they're currently standing, because no level of schooling taught them how to do that.
No, and so much of schooling is just, it's just crazy. Like there is at the University of Oklahoma where I went, there is a school of journalism. Who's going to get a journalism job at this point? Like, they need to learn to code.
Right.
That industry is collapsing, and there are probably actually more journalists than ever before, but they're independent. I think that you serve as a journalist to some degree, Brett. And so there may be more journalists than ever before, but the employment maybe isn't there, and the structure is different than it was before. But they're still cranking out graduates of that school, and it doesn't jive with reality. So
sure.
We're doing a disservice to those people.
There's still plenty of places to write.
Right.
We would agree. But that industry is certainly changing. And I was a communications major in 1995. I found out recently the college I went to is closing, so I'm debating going back there for a farewell in a couple of months. I am afraid to go and see how much their communications program has changed. It must be different than it was. I was there at a really bad time. While everything was changing over to digital in the real world, we were still learning about the analog ways of doing things. But
were you splicing tape with a razor blade?
Splicing tape with a razor blade? No, we were doing mostly VHS. So VHS was nice. You didn't have to do any splicing. We were laying out newspapers with hot wax.
Yeah.
But a lot of people have that story even now. I'm going to be putting out a show next week on School Sucks with a guy who trains people in digital marketing. And he was telling me that people are coming out of 4-year marketing programs in college having learned nothing, being told that Facebook ads are a fad. Now, depends on how you define fad, right? Maybe if your time scale is 25 years, 50 years, okay, you could call Facebook ads a fad, but that certainly doesn't mean it's something that should be dismissed as part of a curriculum for learning marketing. Right now, it is a crucial part of marketing operations for many businesses, but a professor says, "Oh, that's just a fad. Facebook, give me a break." Well, it's here now, and it's relevant now, and it's relevant to the jobs that person is going to have in marketing a year or two from now.
It can drive sales for a company right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have a young friend. His name's Aaron Johnston, and he was going to a magnet school here in Tulsa, and he ended up buying a little online retail business. It's called cherryloop.com, and they sell figure skating supplies.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting niche. But he learned how to place Facebook ads and run Google AdWords and write decent email ad copy and stuff while he was doing that. And he got a couple of free ride scholarships to some pretty darn good schools. And he told his parents, I need to take a gap year.
Yeah.
But he ended up just continuing to work on his business, and he got all of these up-to-date, cutting-edge marketing skills in running his own small business. And then later on, he has shifted, and now he does online marketing for other online retailers. Mm. And he's got a company called Battle Bridge Labs. Never went to college for it. It is crushing that market because his education in that is day to day, up to date, and it has been since the minute he hit the ground. And he wasn't given any prejudicial information about Facebook being a fad from some professor. He is practical. He wants it to work, and that's his test.
Right.
And he's done super well, and he never went to college, never got the debt, has employees, is killing it.
Mm-hmm.
He's living the dream, I think.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we've done a lot of encouraging of on my show, right, is finding paths around higher education. Like, how do you find the right apprentice? How do you find the right mentor? How do you find the right fast-track training programs, things like Praxis that I talk about all the time. Praxis is just a company that, places a person in an apprenticeship and it works lateral to a, professional development kind of training. It's the cost of one semester of college. It pays for itself while you're doing it. Like that kind of an overpass where all the fat is cut, all the waste is done away with. There isn't all this bloat like you have in higher education. Those are the things we're looking for. Those are the people that I want to talk to. Those are the solutions that I want to promote. It is so destructive for so many people to start out their lives not only losing, maybe $150,000 in like lost wages, right? That's lost wages in those 4 or 5 years that they spend in college. But also maybe up to $100,000 in debt in some cases, and they've been shielded from the real. It's not universally bad across the board. There's lots of good reasons to go to college. There's lots of people that college is the right choice for. The problem is what we're trying to make a dent in is this egalitarian idea that everybody needs to go to college, that college is the 13th grade, that you are not successful educationally until you have a 2 or a 4-year degree. That's a problem, especially with the opportunities in this economy. Like obviously digital marketing is one of the best examples, but there are others of ways that you can be learning, like you build a foundation of going to work. It could be anything. My father said to me when I was 17 and I was really debating, like I didn't want to go to college, right? I had serious reservations about it because I had done so poorly in high school and I was so uninterested in school. The best information that he had in 1994 was that this was the opportunity, right? This is the opportunity to turn things around. And he said to me, you can get what you think is a pretty decent job right now. I detailed cars. I made $6 an hour. He said, you might get a job making $10 an hour, $12 an hour, and compared to the work you're currently doing, you will feel rich. And you might just make a career out of that. And he said, I've seen that happen to so many people. I appreciate that he was trying to protect me from what he thought was a bad decision. And in my case, one of the difficult things is I was so unfocused and so wayward that I actually think the exposure to the college environment, even though I almost got kicked out for both academic and disciplinary reasons my freshman year, eventually I came to see the value of education there. So I always remember that when I criticize that I proved my abilities to myself in college. But that doesn't seem to be the experience for a majority of people. I had one professor who demanded a lot of me, expected a lot of me, demanded a lot of me. And when I met those demands, I felt accomplished. I felt a real sense of intellectual accomplishment. Like, oh my gosh, I actually have interesting things to say in the world of ideas. That was startling to me. I had never had that experience at any point in my schooling life. So, I don't issue this as advice, but the idea that college is the rule, that idea has to go, right? I don't say go to college, don't go to college. I'm not making any hard and fast rules about it, but the idea that it's for everybody, that there's, everybody in college is so the people who are promoting the egalitarian idea of college for everybody, they love to use words like diversity and inclusion, except when it's like diversity of paths and choices, inclusion of options. Then it's off the table for some reason. But everybody is so different, and that's has been a big part of what I've argued at lower levels of education, which is why I promote unschooling, home education, self-directed learning, why we talk so much on School Sucks about intrinsically motivated education, because you could never have a one-size-fits-all for education. And I think the same is true with the upper levels of schooling, of higher education. And starting with the very choice to go or not.
Right. Yeah, the idea that you should go. Mm-hmm. Like in 1958, like if you could go to college and did, man, I don't know if that was an automatic, but it's pretty close.
It was probably the best opportunity that you had. Sure.
Yeah. So that's 1958. At some point, that stopped being true. And I don't know if that was 1998 or if it was 1978 or when or 2008. But at some point, that stopped being true. And now information and trades, I'm going to call digital marketing even a trade, change so rapidly. I don't know how you can actually teach people in a static setting over, 12, 16, 4 years, whatever, and prepare them for what is the fast-paced world of, work in the United States at this point. I don't know. In higher education, I went to this crappy school in rural Oklahoma. My IQ's all right. But my education there wasn't very good, and I ended up going to the University of Oklahoma, and I didn't know how to play that game. I didn't know how to do that. Like, school's a game. Like, there's a certain way you do it. There's a certain amount of butt kissing. There's a certain amount of there's stuff you got to do if you're going to win that game, and it's not just do the homework. It's not just, do well on the test. Like if you wanted to go to medical school in the early 90s when I was at the University of Oklahoma, there was a game that had to be played. And so as this quasi-reform redneck from rural Oklahoma going to this school, I would see people there in that pre-med program who knew how to do that. Maybe their dad or their mom was a doctor, or maybe both of their parents were professional people and their parents had gone through it. And so my parents were this baby boomer age. So these are these baby boomer parents. They had done it. Maybe even their grandparents had done it. Like they knew how to do school. Well, I just knew how to not be truant.
Right.
And I knew that I was at a disadvantage in that venue. I knew it. I was keenly aware of it. For example, I think that people that go to college know that, like, if you're not in a sorority or a fraternity, you don't have the test files they have access to, right? Of like the past tests, and there's an infrastructure that those people have access to that if you're an independent like I was, you didn't have.
Sure.
And so I didn't have that. And I, like I said, I was keenly aware of that the whole time I was there. It felt like a rigged game to me. I'm not going to say that the whole thing is rigged and there's only like a select few winners, but there was definitely a piece of institutional knowledge that you needed to have to go to a big 4-year university and have the best possible outcome.
Sure.
Like you can't go in there with no shoes, and like, some hillbilly and just crush the shit out of it. Like you can have a good outcome, but if someone says dad's an attorney and his mom is a doctor and their grandparents went to school and all of their fucking grandparents went and they all come on the alumni day and all that stuff, they've got advantages I didn't have.
Right. The legacy.
So yes, it's worth something. And then yesterday, we saw this news break about these Hollywood mediocrities that were paying hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars to get their kids to go to these, frankly, not that great of a school and be placed on the sports teams. Felicity Huffman is one of them that's been named, and Lori Loughlin, Aunt Becky from Full House, who I always thought was like piping hot, by the way.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so upset that Aunt Becky did that.
I learned that this was actually the plot of an episode of Full House, season 6, called Be True to Your Preschool, where Uncle Jesse actually forges or fakes certain information. He fills out forms to get the two. They have twins eventually. If people didn't follow Full House all the way to the end, they got married and they had 2 twin boys, I think. So he's like fudging this preschool application to get the boys in to the school. I'm sure that episode is currently circulating, ironically. But, the kind of what's irritating to me is I'm somewhat suspicious this is only a story because famous people are involved. I certainly, when these things happen, people post in the Facebook group, people email me links, and I'm thinking, is this news? Is this just all of America, mainstream America, saying the phrase college scam for the first time?
Well, you know what I think it is?
Yeah.
This has been going on forever. Everybody knew that if the school had a wing named after your dad, that you got to go. Mm-hmm. Like that's always been a trope, right? And I think this is ultimately about going after Kushner.
Oh, interesting. Because, whenever a story just like takes the national news by storm, my new question is, how are they going to tie it to Trump? Right? Like if something has all of this momentum and energy and interest and anchor enthusiasm, it's like, but how are they going to throw this turd at Trump and get it to stick to him? So I think there's going to be a few outcomes of this that we find disappointing. I'm pretty neutral on the Jared Kushner thing. I don't really care about him one way or the other. But you're right. I have started to see that most of the commentary on this seems to mention that at the time Jared Kushner was applying to, I guess, was it Harvard or Yale?
It's Harvard.
Okay, that his father, who also, side note, wound up in jail for other reasons, made
I did not know that.
It might have been some kind of fraud charge. I'm not sure, but he made like a $2.5 million, again, unrelated contribution to the school at the time Jared was applying.
Mm-hmm.
And there's obviously one thing that is newsworthy about the current scandal is that when somebody is super rich, like what we're seeing right now is a path for the medium rich, right? The people who can't afford to buy the building or put up the new dining hall or the new, the new beautiful glass building where all of these unnecessary administrators are going to go, the college as it just bloats because of its federal funding. These people need a pen to be in all day and probably do nothing. I'm sorry. That's commentary. But for the people who can't afford to provide the college with those kinds of resources, we see through this current breaking news a new path that has been created over the last 10, 15, 20 years, however long this has been going on. So I think that's an interesting component to this, is that when Jared Kushner's dad, and none of the people criticizing Jared Kushner thanked the dad because everybody at the school got to use that money.
Right.
Right? This is money going into the pockets of individual at various levels or at various places in the chain of the admissions process.
Yeah, from what I understand, some of this money was just paid to people to help them forge papers, frankly.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And some of it was to certain figures in the athletic programs, and it's all over the place apparently. But in the context of this conversation we're having, it's not so much like the particulars of the scandal. It's just like, what is this schooling? What is it? Like, what is this game? Like, what are we doing? So if you've got Lori Loughlin's kids and Felicity Huffman's kids there, I think it was at USC, both of those.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just, some poor Hispanic kid from, East LA or whatever, trying to get into that school. And then this kind of stuff's going on. It's like, what is that you are doing? What are you participating in? Is it actually an education? Or is it some sort of a validation process, right? Like, they get their kids in there, you get out, they've stamped your passport, right? Mm-hmm. This person is the kind of person that goes there. It's a club membership, maybe, at this point.
Yeah, and there's kind of a paradoxical thing happening here, right? So obviously, in the public mind, largely due to propaganda, this egalitarian campaign that's been running at least since you and I were in high school, that everybody has to go to college, this progressive idea. And a lot of that propaganda, people will learn this in the next episode of School Sucks, is actually generated by college organizations, right? Yeah. The College Board and beyond. And there's, I think, NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, is another conglomerate that produces a bunch of data, data that is collected, no problem, but then the way a lot of the data is presented is definitely a problem, and it's very, very misleading. So in the public mind, the value of the degree has been inflated. Everybody needs one. This is the key to opportunity in life. But at the same time, it's devalued in its attainability, right? Because anybody can get one. And it's also devalued in its practical meaning because anybody can have one. It doesn't separate people like it used to, the 4-year degree. And I don't think this is an elitist argument. I think this is just a recognition of reality. So now you have people who are, in the 1%. I'm just using that as a shorthand. Who are, but they're not in the 0.01%. But they're people of means, and they're saying to themselves, okay, so just getting a BS or a BA is worthless. Now what? How do we get an edge? So, this has been, how do I get so-and-so on the crew team at this prestigious school for crew? Right. How do I get people into Ivy League schools? You're right. Like the variety of schools is pretty mixed. So obviously the guy who is running this scheme, Rick Singer. Sorry, I merged him with Rick Springfield in my mind for a second, who was a singer. But his name was Rick Singer. His name was Rick Singer. I'm guessing that he's catering to his clients. So the parent says, we want USC or we want, this Ivy, and he comes up with a path and a plan to get them there. But yeah, I saw the list of schools, and a couple of them were kind of curious choices, right? Like, why would you? I mean, I think the top price I saw being paid was $6 million. I saw another one over $1.2 million. So, there are people who are saying it needs to be, again, people of means, it needs to be more than just a bachelor's degree from the college that, Lori Loughlin's daughter could probably get into. I don't know if you saw her quote on her YouTube channel. Somebody pulled a clip of her going, yeah, so I am going to go to college, but really just going for the parties and the social thing. I really don't care about school. You guys know that. So you don't even really need to make an argument that spot could go to a more qualified candidate.
She didn't want it.
No, and I don't know if it was her or Hoffman's daughter, where there was actually like a Photoshop of one of them rowing crew. And I'm thinking to myself, could that be real? Like, what is the vetting process at the college like if you could submit a photoshopped photo and there's no background check on that? So just like
that's Singer's expertise. He knows what sports you can get into without a tryout, probably.
Right. And I think that exposes that obviously there's like administrative expansion and administrative waste. That's not the only place where you have that happening in like these, first of all, like worthless programs of study, unnecessary administrators. But I think athletics is a problem as well. And if coaches of sports like water polo are having that much sway in the admissions process, that's probably also something that needs to be looked at. But somebody posted the Reason article. Reason wrote an article like, we need to shoot the college admissions process into the sun.
I saw that.
Yeah. So I just pulled this little excerpt from it. Bribing athletic officials to falsely claim the client was a high-value recruit for a certain sport. This often involved sending fake photos of the kids engaged in athletic activities, pole vaulting, swimming, that's ambitious, right? That's just brazen. Like, yeah, it was a pole vaulter and your face is photoshopped on a pole vaulting person. For sports, they don't actually play. So it was either Laughlin's daughter or Huffman's daughter that was presented as somebody who was like a high up member of this crew association, I think in Los Angeles, and they get into USC as a result of this. So
you people listening, if you got somebody that's good at Photoshop, I want you to Photoshop Brett's head on Allison Stoke pole vaulting, and then we're going to submit that to like every state university in the country and see if we can get Brett a scholarship.
I love that. I could at least use it as cover art for this episode.
Allison Stoke. It's ridiculous.
Hey, this is producer Trent. That is the end of part 1 of our interview with Brett from the School Sucks podcast. We'll be back next week with part 2. This is a nice meaty discussion, so decided to split it up into 2 parts. In the meantime, make sure you go check out Brett at the School Sucks podcast, available at all the same places you download your online Great Books podcast. Also, you can check out Brett at the School Sucks project, where he's got a lot of interesting content. He's got videos and he's got other written resources on a wide variety of topics. It ranges from health and fitness to entrepreneurship, history, philosophy, and many more. So go check them out there. And as always, go to onlinegreatbooks.com. And if you haven't yet, sign up for the VIP list. It's free, you get a lot of cool stuff with it, and you'll be first on the list when enrollment opens back up in just a few days. That's right, enrollment will be opening again to sign up for Online Great Books on March 25th. So go sign up for that VIP list now and get your spot in line. All right, we'll see you next week. Thanks.